I think we still are in a situation that can be best described as post-war rather than post-conflict. And what I mean in particular by that is that we're not in a post-conflict situation defined in terms of ensuring that the roots of conflict, the sources of conflict, are not being sustained or reproduced. I think that's very important to remember. The trajectory of development since 2009 haven't been particularly propitious in terms of addressing those real root causes of the conflict, and arguably we have certainly reinforced some of them, sustained and reproduced them, as well as introduced some new ones, and I will come to that. The second point that I want to make is that I think there has been a fairly widespread notion of Sri Lanka, and certainly at the same time a vision of Sri Lanka that a lot of us have held to, that is of a multi-ethnic, multi-religious country, which is also a formal, functioning, albeit flawed democracy. And what I want to suggest to you is that what's happening in this country today is that that vision, that notion, is under very, very serious threat. And very serious threat and challenge from three things in particular, the way I see it. The first one is institutionalized militarization. The second one is an almost complete collapse of the rule of law and near complete state capture by the ruling dynasty. And the third one is a creeping religious intolerance. All three of them go to the very heart of the notion of Sri Lanka as a formal, functioning democracy, which is wedded to a notion of a multi-religious, multi-ethnic society underpinned by the formal institutions of democracy, namely the rule of law, equality before the law, and all of that. Now, if you take the very first one, militarization is particularly acute in the north and the east of the country, but not necessarily so. Just a few miles from here, I can't remember the precise distance, there is an area called Marble Bay. Marble Bay consists of private land, taken over by the Sri Lankan Navy. I happened to actually visit it with one of the local inhabitants who told me that his ancestral home had been taken over by the Navy. And what I came across was absolutely shocking, because I had only seen a visual image of what I was confronted with from photographs of from apartheid South Africa. In that, the bay, as well as the beach, was cordoned off, was roped off. VIPs, service personnel, and the general public. And as you can imagine, the largest section in terms of the largest number of people was, of course, with the general public, and as we went along, it decreased in terms of numbers. But what was particularly shocking was that the division was maintained in the sea as well. The division was maintained in the sea as well. So you can see the extent to which a power hierarchy has been imposed on a society following the conflict. A second example is, of course, as some of you may well know, in the last week, we've had arguably the biggest land grab in this country since independence. And that is a land grab that is going on in the north and east. But in the north in particular, in a particular area of Jaffna called Valikama North, there are over 6,300 acres of private land which has been taken over by the armed services of the country. For a cantonment, for a presidential secretariat, for hotels, God only knows what. But it is 6,300 odd acres, which affects something like 9,000 odd families. And this is only in Valikama North. Right? We have now over 1,400 odd petitioners, individuals, who have filed applications in the Court of Appeal, and we're expecting another 2,000 in the rest of the week against this acquisition. To cut a long story short, they're probably not going to get their land back. But at the present moment, they can't even see it. And I know this firsthand because I tried to go in there with some landowners, and we were refused entry. And again, to cut a longer story short, after a series of negotiations, we were told effectively that the civilians would be taken around the perimeter of the 6,300 acres, rather than actually go and see their land. One of the people who was with me was a landowner who was born in a house in that area in 1990 and had never seen it since, and wanted to see it before it was taken away. Then you have, for example, in Japan, you have the statement made by a brigadier, or was it a major general, Pereira, who made the point that on the 19th of May, civilians will be allowed to mourn their dead as long as they are not LTT carded. Mourning the death of my son or brother or sister or mother who may have been an LTT carder is tantamount to an act of treason. And this is why I say that the degree of militarization is a degree of militarization which tells individuals, civilians, citizens of this country, whether they can mourn, whether they can remember. And this is only touching the tip of an iceberg. In effect, in the North, the army is the last word on anything. People can't congregate and talk about politics. You can't have sports meets, you can't have prize givings without getting permission from them. There's a presidential task force which is empowered with deciding on the major development projects, and of course, you have to get permission from them as well as from the army. Only 2 weeks ago, the most influential newspaper in the northern province, the Udayan newspaper, its distribution center in Kilinochchi was destroyed, and the headquarters of the newspaper was destroyed, and its printing press burned. Now, this is significant again because estimates vary. There are some people who will tell you that in Jaffna, for example, there is at least 1 soldier for every 10 civilians. In Kilinochchi, the figure is sometimes told as 1 to 5 or 1 to 4, or 1 to 4 there. So you have arguably these kinds of acts happening in one of the most militarized places in the world, apart from it being the most militarized place in Sri Lanka, which then in turn suggests that there is collusion, complicity by the armed forces themselves in these actions. But you go a bit further, and I'm trying to race here, in that the armed forces are now allowed to dictate elements of public policy and even the education system. University students, before they join university, are told that they must join a leadership training course run by the armed forces in military camps. School principals are inducted into the National Cadet Corps because there is apparently a need for greater discipline and organized thinking as far as the education system is concerned. And it goes on like that. They are involved in the economy. There are farmers who are employed by them. They themselves grow and sell vegetables. They run wayside boutiques. They run hotels, travel agencies. So in effect, they're also engaged in the economy and taking jobs and opportunities for employment away from locals, the local civilians. Move to the next one, which is the collapse of the rule of law. And all of these things are tied up. When you have a degree of militarization like that, there really is no recourse in terms of relief. Absolutely none, whatever. The epitome of the collapse of the rule of law, of course, was the total sham that we had with the impeachment of the Chief Justice. If you read the Sri Lankan newspapers, you will get reference to the 43rd Chief Justice and the 44th. Our tourism tagline is a country like no other. And indeed we are. We have 2 Chief Justices. We have 2 Chief Justices. The issue there was on the question of the due process by which that impeachment was effected. There is sufficient circumstantial evidence, if nothing else, to say that it was a pure political witch hunt. all tenets of natural justice were overlooked, and the orders and judgments of the apex courts of this country, that is the Supreme Court and the Court of Appeal, declared that impeachment process to be unconstitutional and illegal. And the government went ahead, in the face of that, went ahead with that impeachment process. But go beyond the impeachment process. In effect, in Sri Lanka today, if you do not have a connection to the ruling party and, in effect, to the ruling family, you're not going to get justice. On the other hand, if you are an alleged perpetrator and a violator of the law, and you have a connection to the ruling party or to the ruling dynasty, you will get off. Almost certainly you will get off. Because impunity rules. Whether it be the issue of egregious human rights violations in the course of the conflict, whether it be with regard to allegations of war crimes, whether it be with regard to cases involving local government officials who are connected to the ruling dynasty, where firearms are involved, cases where there are sexual assault involved as well. If you get a prosecution, you will find that within a couple of weeks, the Attorney General's Department will withdraw the prosecution. Or alternatively, if you get an indictment, you may well get suspended sentences and you may get out on bail. So complete collapse of the rule of law in that sense. An ordinary citizen does not necessarily have the confidence that the institutions of justice are going to deliver in the way that they ought. And again, you can see in certain cases the most blatant examples, illustrations of the selective use of the law. And this comes also to my third point, which is about religious intolerance. As you know, in the last couple of months, you have had this phenomenon, which has been well documented, of attacks by extremist groups claiming to be Buddhist groups against the Muslim community in this country. The argument goes against the halal certification of products and produce, to the argument that, and this is where it turns into an absolutely Goebbelsian episode in our history. It's absolutely fascist episode, where you have stories advanced that Muslim shopkeepers provide sweets to Sinhalese women who shop in their establishments, which will make them infertile. That according to some calculations on the basis of the existing birth rate, this country will cease within 2.5 decades to be a similar Buddhist country. And it goes on. Now, these people have attacked Muslim places of worship, prayer halls, mosques. Only the other day, they destroyed an ancient Sufi shrine in this country, a 1,200-year-old shrine in Kurugala. They have attacked Muslim establishments. The law of the land has not been used against them. There is photographic evidence of the police looking the other way. The Defense Secretary of this country, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, seems to be providing them tremendous patronage, including being present as the chief guest at the launch of their leadership academy. So they can get up and say that they can act as some kind of moral police force and use violence against people. In one of the examples of an attack on a shop in an area outside the outskirts of Colombo, you had the shopkeeper at the end of the day coming out and saying, the Muslim shopkeeper saying, I do not want to press charges because people in robes are involved and the international profile of the country will be tarnished. The DIG, the Deputy Inspector General of Police in charge of the case, says, look, isn't this a wonderful example of communal amity and harmony? But no one dare question as to why, whether the shopkeeper was going to attain nirvana or whatever the hell it was, why the state did not decide to prosecute where there was evidence of criminal activity. It was not up to the shopkeeper or the shop owner to decide whether there should be a prosecution or not. The law of the land must prevail. There has been no categorical condemnation by the powers that be with regard to this religious intolerance. Now, that is why the phenomenon is so dangerous, because what we have now in this country is basically a dynastic project. You have three brothers plus their children, etc., who in effect, and that's only the tip of the iceberg, on paper, control something between 70 to 80% of the national budget. Between 70 to 80% of the national budget. The President is the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Defense. One brother is the Minister of Economic Development, which is a jumbo ministry covering everything from the kitchen sink to tourism to foreign employment to you name it. The other brother is the Secretary of Defense, who basically controls the national security establishment, to which is now attached also the Urban Development Authority. It is a dynastic project which is underpinned by militarization and seeks to legitimize itself on an assertive and populist majoritarian ideology, of pushing the majority identity in this country as an ideology, similar Buddhism, their version of it. Secondly, they believe that economics can trump politics, in that their notion of development will take the place of civil and political rights, will be the panacea with regard to national unity and reconciliation. None of that seems to be working at the present moment, but they certainly are pushing it at home by constantly talking about international conspiracies to defeat them, including, the conspirators include even people around this table at the end of the day. Yeah. It is a strong regime at one level, but also a deeply insecure one at another. So Sri Lanka, after having been the kind of textbook democracy in South Asia, voting for 7 decades, changing governments with great frequency in the first 5 to 6 decades of that period, is now on the cusp of being turned into a Pakistan of Europe, a Burma of Europe. We say that we want to be a Malaysia or a Singapore, but someone laughed and said that this was some time ago, before the junta decided to relax itself, that whilst the plane may take off for Malaysia or Singapore, it may end up landing in Burma. And what that means, of course, is that you have a collapse of any vestiges of the liberal democratic order that we had and the pluralism and dynamism that we had to a basic fascist regime. So I leave it